This video is focusing on question 3 of the AQA English Language Paper 1. Before you work through this video, you're going to need to download yourself a copy of the Jamaica In source, which can be accessed by following this link here. When you have clicked on that link, it will take you through to the AQA page for specimen papers, and you need to select paper 1. It should just automatically download, and then you can access the source and also question 3. Okay, question 3 is another 8 marker, so again we would suggest that you would spend about 10 minutes on this question. Question 3 is going to ask you to comment on how the writer uses structure for effect and impact. Now, when you're thinking about structure, you need to remember that that is the way that the text has been organised or the way that it's been built up. I like to think of structure like Jenga blocks. If you've ever played that game, where you stack the wooden blocks on top of each other. And when we're looking at structure, what we're thinking about is how those blocks have been stacked on top of each other, and also why they've been done in that way. Another way to think about structure is to imagine the writer as a video camera, and as a reader we are viewing everything through that video camera, which therefore means that the writer, if we imagine him to be that video camera, is able to shift our focus and our attention onto different things. For instance, he or she can sort of move to the left and ask us to focus on something else. They can zoom in on a certain feature and basically control the reader, control where the reader's focus and attention is currently at. Some general questions then to ask yourself whilst you are thinking about the structure of the source that you've been given is: how does the text work as a whole? How does the text change and develop? How does the writer build and organise the extract? And where is the writer focusing the reader? Where are they turning our attention? Structure can be broken down into 3 main categories. One of the easiest ways to understand those categories is to use the house analogy. So the 3 categories are development of the whole text, paragraphs, and then sentences. And we almost need to think of those as separate levels. If we think about the house analogy to start with, the development of the text is sort of taking a step back and looking at the house as a whole, looking at the overall shape and structure. So in terms of applying that to writing, that's where you sort of need to stand back and consider the text as a whole, the mood and the way that it develops and the way that it progresses. The second level of structural analysis can be on paragraphs. Now, if we go with this house analogy, that's where you sort of consider the number of floors, how many stories it's got, the foundations, and what that translates to in terms of writing is actually the paragraphs and how they're broken down. And also the focus within those paragraphs is really important. Then we come down to our final level, so we kind of move from the macro whole picture of the house down to the paragraphs, and now we're on the kind of micro level of sentences. So in terms of the house, this would kind of be the bricks and the cement, the kind of finer things that push the house together. But in terms of writing, this is actually where we're looking at sentences and kind of the links that join the writing up to make the whole picture. Okay, so let's look at this analogy in more detail then, especially what it means in terms of writing. So if you think about development of the whole text, which if you remember back to our house analogy is kind of stepping back and looking at the whole shape of the house, that might include you breaking that down to sort of look at the mood of the text, so the atmosphere that's being created, establishing what's happening at the beginning of the extract, if anything changes as we move to the middle, and then if anything changes as we move to the end. So generally, you're looking at the way that the text develops. Another thing to look for in terms of development of the text are any patterns or motifs that have been used. So patterns and motifs are recurring images or ideas or objects that pop up in a piece of writing, and some of those can be of interest. Okay, then let's move on to this paragraph level. So we're getting in a bit closer now and looking at how the paragraphs have been structured. And what this essentially comes down to is this idea of shifts in ideas and perspectives. Now, what that can break down to is any movement really from something that's big, has a big focus, down to a smaller focus. Anything that takes us from inside to outside or vice versa. Any shifts from place to place, so kind of locations within a text. We can have kind of more psychological shifts, so for instance, moving from reality to a dream or to imagination. We can also have shifts in time. And then something else which also links in on this paragraph level is the idea of narrative voice. We're just going to move away from that for a second, just to have a little look further at what a bit of a reminder of narrative voice and what that means. So narrative voice is essentially what perspective has the writer taken. And the first level of looking at narrative voice is actually the narrative perspective. So first person, for instance. The characters, this is where we see the characters' direct thoughts, so they'll use pronouns such as me, I and my. Second person is where the character, or the narrator talks about somebody else, so this is where you'll get the use of the pronouns such as you, yours and your. And then finally, in terms of narrative perspective, you can have third person, so this describes the actions of somebody else. So it's an overall view of what's happening, and this is where you'll see the use of the pronouns he, she, they, or even somebody's name. So those narrative perspectives can also be paired up with different types of narrators. We firstly can have an objective narrator, and this is where you need to imagine that the narrator is just like a video camera, so they can only report on what can be seen and heard, so they don't go inside the thoughts of a character or inside a character's head. They can literally just pick up on what can be seen and heard, just like a video camera. For something a bit more personal, a writer can also choose to use limited omniscient narrator. This is where the narrator reveals the thoughts of only one character, so they talk about what the other characters do and say, but not actually what they think. And then we have the omniscient narrator. So this is the narrator that knows everything that's going on. It's almost like they've got VIP access, because there's no kind of area or character that they aren't able to explore in full detail. So this is an omniscient narrator would be able to kind of access the thoughts of every character in their novel or in their text, and kind of give us the full picture. Okay, so moving back then to these three categories that you can look at in terms of structural analysis. So we've already looked at development of the text as a whole. Then we've looked at more at a paragraph level and shifts in ideas and perspectives. Now if we zoom down to a sentence level, this is where we're looking at coherence and cohesion devices. So basically things that link up the writing. So categories that you might break this down into are vocabulary, specifically semantic fields, so the way that vocabulary links together to give us a general feel. You can have links within paragraphs, topic sentences, and maybe the use of time connectives, or sometimes even the use of dialogue. Okay, so let's look at the question that we're going to be dealing with then. As always, it's always important, as with any of the other questions, it's always important to underline the key terms and instructions within the question. The question is as follows then. You now need to think about the whole of the source. This text is from the opening of a novel. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? The example will then give you 3 bullet points, and do take note of these bullet points because they are designed to sort of steer you in the right direction. So you could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops, any other structural features that interest you. So as we've done before, just pause the video now and underline for yourselves the key bits of this question, the bits that you think are giving you the most hints and tips. So hopefully you paused the video and came up with something similar. So firstly, it's important to note that this particular question says the whole of the source, which means that you aren't going to need to draw a box around any section of the text because it's not limiting you. I can't guarantee that that will be the case in every single question, so do just take note. Obviously, if it does say look at lines 1 to 20 or whatever it says, then obviously you would need to follow the process that we've practiced with the other questions, which is to draw a box around the section of text, but obviously that isn't relevant here. How has the writer structured the text? So with the use of the word structure, that's inviting you to draw on those 3 categories that we've just looked at. So development of the text, shifts in ideas and perspectives, and then also cohesive devices. Here's another interesting and vital bit of the question is the idea of interest you as a reader, because that's the topic of this question. So every comment that you make about structure needs to link back to this idea of how are we as the reader being interested by these structural choices. And then finally, as we said before, don't neglect to look at these bullet points because they're kind of reminding you of the things that you should be looking out for. Okay, so let's deal with the analysis, the structural analysis of this Jamaica Inn source in categories. And the first category is development of the text. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and actually have a look at some of these, have a look for some of these areas yourself within the text. The first area that you might like to consider is the mood and the atmosphere. So when we're thinking of mood and atmosphere, you're basically going to be able to pick up on that through the choice of vocabulary. That's going to be your biggest indicator. Don't just try and go for a general sum up of the mood and atmosphere. Try to notice how the atmosphere and the mood perhaps changes as the text develops. I mean, that's the key with structure. You are looking at developments within the text really and how things change. What I like to do is just to sum up in one key word at the side of each paragraph exactly what the mood and atmosphere is of that paragraph, because when you've written it in the margin, just in simple terms, it can be easier to track. So I would definitely suggest that. If we look at the next section, the next topic that you're going to try and analyse in a minute, look at the beginning. The progression from the beginning to the middle to the end. So you're going to take each paragraph individually, and similarly to what I've just said with mood and atmosphere, try to sum up the focus of the paragraph with just one word. Again, that's going to help you to track the way that the writer's developing that as we move through the source. And then finally, one thing that you're going to look for in development, in the development of text section, is the use of patterns or motifs. So what you need to look for are any recurring ideas, objects, actions or images throughout the source. So if you pause the video now, with those key areas in mind, try to analyse the development of the text and see if there's anything that pops up that would be interesting for you to comment on in your answer. So hopefully you've paused the video and found some structural points of interest. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that you could have found, but just some key observations that I have come up with. In terms of mood and atmosphere, you might have noticed that at the beginning we have quite a mysterious and gloomy, maybe hopeless atmosphere. Just quotes here to support, cloaking them in mist. But then as we move through the extract, actually the atmosphere becomes a bit more disgruntled, a bit angry and a bit tense, particularly when we're with the angry passenger inside the coach who rose from his seat in a fury. But eventually we actually have a bit more of a light-hearted comical tone when we are introduced to the red-faced woman who winks at anyone who might be looking. And then finally the extract seems to end on a bit more of a pensive mood and atmosphere, so a bit thoughtful and introverted, where we see that Mary Yellen is sat with her chin in her hands. In terms of beginning, middle and end, if you put if you try to sum up the words, try to sum up the focus of each paragraph, then you may have come up with this. So to start with, the focus is just on the countryside. Then we move to the driver, to the coach, to the angry man, back to the driver, then to the red-faced woman, and then to Mary Ellen's thoughts. So hopefully when you've put all of that together, you may have noticed that there's actually a gradual zoom from large to small here, which kind of overlaps with the whole idea of shifts in perspective, but we'll come on to that in a second. Then finally, in terms of patterns and motifs, hopefully you will have recognised that we have the recurring image of the rain. So in line 6, we've got now and again little drops of rain fell softly through. A bit later on, we've got rain again, bringing a shower of rain upon himself and his fellow passengers. And then right at the end of the extract, we've still got that motif of rain. Sometimes a cold drip of moisture fell on her shoulder. Okay, so let's move on to our second category then. So we've done development through the text. Now we're on to the sort of paragraph level where we're thinking about shifts in ideas and perspectives. So I want you again to pause the video in a minute, and what I want you to look out for are specific movements within the paragraphs. Maybe you might like to focus on movements from big to small, inside to outside, place to place, so location to location. This idea of reality to dream or imagination, any shifts in time, and then you also might like to consider the use of the narrative voice as well. So just pause the video and have a go at that yourself. Okay, so hopefully you've paused it and found some things that you would be able to talk about. Not everything on that previous slide was relevant in this extract, but perhaps you did identify the idea of big to small. So as we kind of outlined before, we have got this gradual zoom from this sort of wide shot. If you imagine, well, linking back to what we said about the writer being a video camera and us viewing everything through that video camera lens, it's almost like we are shown that wide shot at the start where we see the countryside, and then gradually as we move through that passage, the video camera sort of zooms the reader in on individual passengers and their thoughts. So we definitely do get a move from the kind of wide, big shot down to a sort of smaller scale. You might also have noticed the shift from inside to outside. So we're taken from outside the coach initially to inside to meet the passengers, but then the angry man draws us actually back outside the coach when he starts to shout at the driver again, but eventually we do move back inside the coach in the end. So we've got 3 different shifts, in fact, between inside to outside. Finally, in terms of the narrative voice, overall it's third person objective narrator because yes, we are seeing what is we as the reader can see what can be seen and heard, but we don't necessarily get access into any of the passengers' thoughts. However, it is interesting to note that actually you could say that shifts to a limited omniscient perspective as we right at the end, because it's almost as if we're given access then. We're sort of starting to transition into Mary Ellen's thoughts and emotions, with the quote hoping with a sort of desperate interest. But generally we've got that kind of fly on the wall perspective. Okay, let's focus now on our last category then. So we've done development through the text and we've looked at it as a whole. We've kind of zoomed into that paragraph level and looked at shifts in ideas and perspectives. And now we're going to focus on the real nitty-gritty stuff, which is the coherence and cohesion section. And essentially what you are looking for is links within the writing. How has the writer kind of threaded everything together? So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to pause the video for the 3rd time and to look at any vocabulary choices, particularly semantic fields. So any vocabulary that kind of links ideas and perspectives within the writing. Paragraph links, you might find topic sentences, any use of time connectives, and maybe any use of dialogue. So if you just pause the video now, try to apply each of those as a focus, and hopefully it will spring up some ideas for you. Okay, so in terms of cohesion and coherence, you may have found more than I have, but the only thing that really stood out for me was the use of the kind of topic sentences. So some examples just here. Grey day, the wind came in gusts, the driver, the wheels of the coach, the few passengers, his nearest neighbour and Mary Yellen. I thought that these topic sentences kind of linked with this idea of this gradual zoom, because it's almost as if the opening sentence of each paragraph is kind of outlining the fact that we are moving from the big scale all the way down to the smaller scale. So, you know, if you look at the topic sentence, the very first one that we come across, this grey day, well, that's this kind of wide shot of the weather and the countryside. But by the time we finish, that topic sentence is indicating that actually we have really shifted now from that wide-angled shot of the countryside all the way down to an individual specific character. Okay, so how do we put this all together then? Once you've collated a range of different ideas that you could put forward in an answer, you then need to start thinking about constructing your PEA paragraphs, so your point, evidence, analyse paragraphs. If you're familiar with any other acronym like PEE, point, evidence, explain, then you know they do the same thing. First thing that you're going to need to start with is a topic sentence, which is where you're going to introduce which of the 3 areas of structure that you'll be discussing. So that just relates to development of the text, paragraph level with shifts in ideas and perspectives, and then also cohesion and coherence. So your topic sentence will outline which one of those your paragraph is going to be focusing on. Then you need to put forward your point. This is where you obviously need to offer a comment about how structure has been used. Don't forget here to incorporate the topic of the question, which is how does it interest you as a reader. Then you need to back that up with a concise quote that's going to really exemplify the point that you've just raised. And then we're into the analysis. So here is where you're going to need to use your subject terminology. Subject terminology in this question is everything that we've already covered, so things like motifs or semantic fields, etc. And this is where you're going to really need to analyse the effect of the structure. So where is the reader being drawn to? How does it interest you as a reader? Generally, how does it affect us as a reader, and how we understand the extract, well, the source that's been put in front of us. So here's an example of what one of those PEA paragraphs might look like with all of those sections within it. So if you just pause the video now, you can read an example of a paragraph about the development of the mood through the text. So yeah, if you want to pause the video now and have a little read of that. Okay, finally, for this question, before we have a recap of what we need to do, here are some useful phrases for question 3. Question 3 is quite unique in the sense that it's the only time that structure is going to crop up on your paper, and therefore you need to write about it with a very structure-based head-on, and a way to do that, and a way to show the examiner straight away that you're very focused on the fact that this is a structural question, and to kind of to show them that you're on task with this with the focus of this question. Here are some useful phrases that you could use to help you move through your answer. So again, just pause the video and jot these down if you don't already have access to them, or just use it as a reminder. Okay, let's have a recap of this process then. So the first step, you are going to need to underline the key parts of the question, remembering to look carefully at whether you've been asked to select just a couple of lines, or whether in fact you're allowed to look at the source as a whole. Next, you need to consider the whole extract for points of interest that you're going to then be able to develop into paragraphs. Remember that those 3 areas that you're looking for are development of the text, shifts in ideas and perspectives, and then also your cohesive and coherence devices. Do make sure that you factor into your revision exactly what some of those entail, as we've practiced before, so that you can go into that exam with a bit of a toolkit already in your hand. And then point 3 is where you need to construct your PEA paragraphs. to put forward your comments on structure, remembering always to link to the topic. And finally, some things to watch out for on this question. Don't focus on language techniques. This is not about similes and metaphors and imagery. It is about the use of structure and the way that we are being manipulated and focused as a reader. So do be careful not to confuse it with language techniques, because you won't get any marks for that. Also, don't fall into the trap of simply retelling the events of the text. That's not what this question is about. Yes, you're analysing the way that it progresses, but you do need to think about the effect that that's having on the reader. And then finally, don't forget to link all structural comments to the question focus.